right.
Hello,
Got my
hello.
co-host here, Phil, and Don, of course, ready to dive into the topic of cryptozoology. Before we get too deep into it, you want to just tell us what piqued your interest into cryptozoology in the first place?
Yeah, as a paleontologist, I'm actually pretty well trained to talk about the topic, not by choice. I got into paleontology for the reason that many people do, which is I got hooked on dinosaurs at age 4 and never grew up. But when I was a member of the Skeptics Society, we had a lot of activity going on. A lot of topics like this came up. And then eventually I realized after I published several other books that sort of fringed on this topic that I should probably tackle it head on. And unfortunately, my good colleague Daniel Loxton up in British Columbia has spent much of his life starting out as a cryptid believer, and then after spending a lot of time as a shepherd in the clear-cut areas of British Columbia looking for Bigfoot, he became a skeptic of the whole thing and then a really excellent scholar of it. So the two of us sort of collaborated. He wrote the more detailed sections on things like Bigfoot and so on. I wrote some of the other chapters as well as the beginning and ending, which talk about the scientific method and how things work. And so we collaborated in a book which has been out a few years now. It's almost 10 years now. It's called Abominable Science, and it's about cryptozoology. And all the art in it is Daniel's. He's an amazing illustrator. He used to be the main illustrator for Skeptic Magazine. And so that book is now, I guess it's 2013 it came out. So it's a decade. I can't believe it's that long. But anyway, it's done pretty well considering that most cryptid believers don't want to even touch a book like that. They just immediately reject its premises. But we felt that it was necessary. There's a lot of people out there writing garbage about Bigfoot and Nessie and all the rest. And we felt it was about time to write a book that actually took a scientific view of the whole thing. And that's why the title, Abominable Science, which was actually suggested by my editor, Columbia University Press, namely the whole thing is about, how they misuse and misunderstand the scientific method, and as well as the details of exactly how each of these stories came to be and why it's not believable anymore. So that's in a nutshell how I got into it. And so I was able to use evidence that comes not just from paleontology, which is my formal background, but also, I was trained as a biologist and geologist both to become a paleontologist. And a lot of the evidence against these things comes from geology or biology. So I spent a lot of time detailing that evidence, and someone who actually physically works on that type of stuff and knows the stories in detail because I've taught it for 45 years at college level. So,
Wow, long time.
Excellent.
I love that you had
Phil?
a childhood interest in this. I grew up with stories and stuff, but never really paid that much attention to it. I mean, the Bigfoot thing here is probably the most that I had any attention to, but it just never made sense to me that it would ever be a real thing. So
yeah, most people the same way. Yeah.
So I look at it just like fantasy fun kind of stuff or comic book fun, just like that great cover there.
It's about one step away from that kind of believing in fairies and ghosts and all the rest. So.
Yeah,
I
mean the cover there just reminds me of the old pulp science fiction books, right? I guess that's what they're.
No,
going
that was deliberate.
There.
I mean, it's designed to look like a tattered cover, even though it's actually not a tattered cover at all, but it's designed to look like a tabloid type of magazine, that you get on the newsstand in the 40s or 50s, which was, sensational cover with big type and spectacular, scary image. And that's exactly what Daniel did there. That's actually closer to what the Yeti is supposed to look like than most people think it is, because Yeti is not supposed to be white. It's supposed to be black. But of course, that's part of its legend as well. So that's a whole chapter about Yeti in there as well.
There's an interesting concept here with the Yeti's nose, because primates like live in colder habitats tend to have downturned nostrils, right?
The platyrine primates do, yes.
Yeah, so that we can keep heat in there.
That's all part of the Yeti story as well as the Sasquatch story, which is, did primates that could have conceivably lived in these places they suppose live now actually evolve? And that is actually one of the biggest false ideas about primate evolution there, which is we know now quite a bit about the primates that did live, say, in the ice ages in those parts of Southeast Asia, and they are nothing like what people have been saying about Yeti. And in fact, there's actually a well-known fossil primate called Gigantopithecus that comes from caves in both Vietnam and also in China that is, a real thing, but it's an orangutan relative. So it would never look anything like, some kind of a human walking, or a big human-like ape walking along. It would be more orangutan-like in proportions if it's really what that we think it is. Although Gigantopithecus is only known from skulls and jaws and some isolated teeth. There's no other parts of the skeleton known, so it's really impossible to know exactly how big it was, but it was definitely huge. So I put
whenever Gigantopithecus comes up, I almost want to cry, because you think about where it was found, in the Chinese medicine shops.
Yeah.
Think of all the bones, there was probably whole femurs of Gigantopithecus, so we could tell its proportions and stuff that were just lost because somebody grinded it up so they could get an erection.
Now the earliest sort of a realization of that came with American and French and other paleontologists who were working in Beijing. They were some of the same people, by the way, who found the Zhougoudian caves of so-called Peking Man, and that was what led them to them, because the Chinese apothecaries in the markets were grinding down fossil teeth and fossil bones that were found in local caves as dragon bones, and of course supposedly
by
have
the thousands
medicinal value. And so a lot of fossils were destroyed that way. I mean, there were fossil rhino teeth and a lot of other things that were found. And these guys discovered these identifiable teeth in the apothecaries, and then managed to find someone who could get the information out of the really secretive markers and find a place where these dragon teeth were coming from. And that's how Zhougoudian caves and the so-called Peking Man were found.
And then that turned out to be a hoax too, didn't it? Peking Man?
Yeah, and that's another long story which we can go into if you want to, but that's not really cryptozoology, because that's a real creature that did live.
A Homo erectus, right?
Yeah, it's now considered a fairly late Homo erectus. That's right.
So there's something I actually learned fairly recently, that they are now believed that there was a species of Paleoloxodont that survived really late into historical China, or potentially into historical China, based on the records. The records of there being wild elephants in the area, there being no elephants remains, but lots of Paleoloxodont remains in the area, and the way that they depict them in the art. Really interesting, because a
lot of people think the Ice Age man was all died out at one big event, but no, that's not the case at all. We now know in America that ground sloths, mastodons, and probably mammoths survived quite late, much later than we thought they did. And there's evidence from the Arctic tundra up in Alaska of DNA of both mammoths and horses about 2,000 years younger than the last bones. So we know that you can't just trust the last bone to know when something went extinct, because their DNA was still floating around 2,000 years later, and that's not going to get, it's not going to be accidental, and it's frozen into the tundra. There were several examples of mammoths that lived up until about the time of the Great Pyramids, but they were mostly isolated in Arctic islands, and they were dwarfed by that point. And there's a ground sloth thought in Cuba to be about only 5,000 years old. So there were still things like that hanging on, and there's always a possibility of more of those hanging on. But
when you throw islands into the mix, you get things like the elephant birds and things like that.
But they were around, probably humans wiped them out. It's pretty well thought that, and we know pretty much without doubt that the moas of New Zealand were also probably wiped out by the Maoris when they first arrived, because they were completely defenseless against human predation. So yes, there have been lots of cases where those things have wiped out fairly recently, and they're definitely survivors of the Ice Age. In some cases, thanks to humans. In some cases, possibly climate, and in many cases, we simply don't know why they vanished. It wasn't all one event at the end of the Ice Ages like it used to be thought. So,
I had a question for you about it deals with mammoths and Bigfoot, because they're linked together in this. And are you familiar with the Headless Valley? And
no, that doesn't ring a bell. Sorry.
Okay, no, it's this valley in the Yukon of Canada, where the people are supposed to be cursed, and they're supposed to be the Naha, I think is the way that you pronounce it, that are Bigfoots that live in the valley, and anybody, and trappers and people that go out there, they always end up finding their bodies, but they never find their heads. It's a
well, at the moment, no bodies have ever actually been recovered by scientists or anyone else yet either. So that's still legend as far as I'm concerned. So
Yeah, and but there's reports of mammoths in that valley too, of people seeing live mammoths. That would be fantastic if we find a
yeah,
mammoth
again,
alive.
I
But
worry about that. The folklore and hearsay,
yeah,
are very, very powerful, and they spread for long distances and many generations. And that is one of the underlying problems with cryptozoology, is that it
Mhm.
takes folklore and takes ideas which were pre-scientific too seriously, as real evidence. I mean, this is something Daniel and I both point out in the book. If you go over these people who keep saying, "Oh, well, there's been hundreds of sightings of this animal, such as Nessie or Bigfoot," and you actually go through it, especially for the case of Nessie, which has been really carefully screened, virtually every one of them ends up being either an obvious hoax or a suspicious case or something that's pre modern, so we can't tell what, as a middle-aged people thought about these kinds of things. And when you do that, you discover most of the data are bad, and yet they keep on using it over and over again, which you would never get away with as a scientist. If you had bad data in your data set, you're supposed to get rid of it and be honest about what you should have that's good. And you don't see that happening with cryptozoologists. And the same with Bigfoot. Most of the trackways have been debunked. We actually know who hoaxed them. Many of the various famous other supposed lines of evidence have been proven to be hoaxes. But every time they come up again, they just keep using what we all know to be crummy evidence, and just keep saying, "Oh, well, look at all the cases." Well, the cases are all individually very flimsy. So a big pile of flimsy cases establishes nothing. And they always said, "Oh, there's a lot of them." Well, there's not necessarily anything behind it just because there's a lot of them.
It's good for tourism. So, like places like the Area 51, they still have all the alien places, but now they're just sort of like restaurants for fun
Yeah.
and shops for
Oh yeah, it's a big tourist draw. I mean,
yeah,
you
yeah.
go to northern part of California, especially Willow Creek and that area where the famous Patterson-Gimlin film was
Patterson
made.
Gimlin.
You go to the various, of course, Loch Ness has a whole industry for tourists there, and I've been there,
Oh yeah.
taken the boat tour of Loch Ness, seen their museum. But there's Lake Okanagan in northern Washington, and Lake Champlain in New York. All of them have supposed lake monsters in them, all of which is ridiculous because they're lakes that are way too small and they were covered by ice during the last ice age. But they have a big tourist draw, and they promote the heck out of it, and often have a summer festival that it's all built around the legend. And of course, if anything brings tourist dollars in is good by their thing. And again, it works every other thing. Roswell, New Mexico makes most of its income from UFO believers.
Yeah.
I used to
Everyone makes pilgrimages to Roswell. And I've been to the area in Rachel, Nevada, just north of Area 51, where they have the famous Ailey Inn, which is a famous little restaurant and mini motel. It's just on the north side of the closed part of Area 51. And we actually ran a Skeptic Society tour there once, and had lunch there, and they had alien burgers and everything else from alien cows, I would guess. But anyway, that's their calling. People come from miles away to
So that's what they're
rural
doing
part
with
of
this
Nevada, which
cat.
has no other attractions except that it's legally the closest place you get to Area 51 before you trip the sensors and the security guards jump you. So
that's what they're doing with those cattle
there,
mutilations. Then
ate that restaurant. And out front they have a big, so-called flying saucer, which is a couple of satellite dishes welded together, hanging from a hook of a tow truck, and lots of cutesy signs all over the place. Anything to get the tourists to come in. So we patronized it twice, once scouting the trip and once actually running the trip there. So
the fun thing about that is once you've taken it into a tourism level, then it doesn't have to be good. You look at the models and the aliens, right? They're just sort of like silly looking, but they're fun now at that stage. So
Mothman is my favorite that they did that with. The Mothman and all the plushies and stuff that you can get with the Mothman with big red eyes. We have a question from one of our live chat people who's often here, Aunt Jur. She rarely misses a show, but Aunt Jur asked, "Are mermaids and unicorns cryptids? What about fairies?"
Yeah, well, all these things are marketed very, very heavily, and they basically, the biggest thing about them is their sources of merchandise. I mean, people find a way to make money off of it, and of course, there's no central group that's gaining from it. It's all everybody for themselves as far as merchandising it. But if it's got something that's catchy and the public's interested in it, especially if it's very popular like Bigfoot, merch sells. If you've ever been to one of these conventions, I've been to one of them, where they have all these people that believe in Bigfoot, the Squatchers they're called. I mean, the biggest area of the whole thing is this giant convention hall with a sales tables that's going from one end to the other, and everybody's selling merchandise, and apparently lots of people are buying. So it's
Is
a
that where you got
moneymaker,
your
and of
shirt
course,
at?
the old American capitalism at its best or worst, is however you want to view it. So,
Did you get your shirt at a convention like that, or did you
oh,
order
I actually
it?
bought this in Scotland at Loch Ness. It says "Keep calm, it's
Ah,
only messy."
Oh,
One of the ways Scotland makes tourist bucks, or whoever made this shirt makes tourist bucks for people who visit the area. So, yeah, I ran a Skeptic Society geotour all over the UK in 2016 for 2.5 weeks. And our last stop when we got to Scotland was go all the way up to Inverness, and then the following morning take a boat tour of Loch Ness all the way out to the castle that's always shown in the shots. And then we also visited their museum, which was actually fairly scientific and fairly skeptical. The whole thing. It actually didn't present a whitewashed version of it. And the whole thing was big fun. And then we finished that, and then our remaining tour just ran us straight from there back to Glasgow, where we flew out the following day. So that was the last day we finished with Loch Ness. So
I gotta say, I'm from Riverside. I know you're from Riverside, Dr. Prothero, and you've done some geology trips out here, especially around some of the
yep,
conventions. And if you ever, anybody out there, if you ever had the chance to get on one of these, I've never been able to because they've been like booked up in 30 minutes. So
really,
if you
yeah.
ever
I
if
know
you've
it
ever
gets
had a
sold pretty quick.
chance,
I didn't actually handle that part of it. So
yeah, if you ever have a chance, jump on it because I hear
yeah, we
I
haven't
hear
done it for a
great
few years
things.
now because as kids are getting into the age where it's tough to do it, and
Yeah.
so and that plus a combination of other factors, we just sort of we haven't really had a trip now pretty much since 2017, and then of course 2 years of COVID. If we wanted to have a trip, we couldn't have. So at
Yeah.
the moment, it's low on our priority list. We enjoy doing it, but I think we've sort of reached our limit. So
so you're a dinosaur guy. You said you started with the dinosaurs and things like that. What about these dinosaurs that they see in there that are reported from the Congo?
right, Mokele Mbembe, yes.
Yes,
Um,
the
Yeah,
Kasai
I
Rex.
wrote that chapter in the book. It's quite an interesting story. It starts out as usual with a lot of folk legends that are reported to, a variety of Western, most European explorers, and then builds up over the years as a sort of a folklore thing. And then in recent years, there have been a number of people who've gone to that part of the Congo, which is mostly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but it goes into other parts of adjacent Gabon and places like that. And what they've discovered is that it's really, people who are gullible and not really biologists going out there and fumbling around and trying their best to discover evidence of this. And every time they interview native peoples of that area who supposedly have seen these things, if you see the videos of their interviews on various programs, it's always a classic case of leading the witness. They will show an image of what they want the animal to look like to these people, and they'll end up, of course, it turns out culturally, many people will tell you yes, anything to yes to make you happy as a guest. They just want to please you. They're not going to say no to something. If you show them an image of a dinosaur, they'll say, "Oh, we have seen that," and that's not. They don't have any sense of truth. Is that they are trying to tell you what you want to hear, and so it's a lot of cultural misunderstanding there. So in that chapter, if you go through it carefully and look at the evidence, of course, none of it holds up to any modern scrutiny. Starting with the fact there are no good photographs and no other things other than sketchy eyewitness reports. And then it gets even more sketchy when you look at the kind of evidence you need to establish this thing. First of all, if it really is a sauropod dinosaur, it could be seen from space by now. And I actually show images in the book of elephants seen from space. And that kind of jungle is dense, but it's not that dense. This is not something we'd miss. And real wildlife biologists, not just clumsy amateurs, have gone through and they know what animals live in the Congo forest. And there's never been a real biologist ever report these things. And then there's other aspects of it too. The early reports of Mokele Mbembe are almost a century old now. And up until about 30 years ago, they were based on the old notion of sauropod dinosaurs that we thought of in 1900 or 1910, which were these big aquatic creatures that spent most of their body at the time in the swamps because their bodies were too heavy to walk on land. And therefore, they dived in the water a lot and so on. What we've learned the last 30, 40 years now is sauropods are terrestrial animals. They have very little evidence they spent
Wow.
any or much time in water at all. And they have air pockets running through their spines and in many other parts of their body, so they can't get below the surface even if they want to. They were never, it was an old notion from a century ago that they were so heavy they needed the support of water. That's no longer even remotely true. So what people are trying to look for in this case is a version of a sauropod dinosaur that has been debunked by science for close to 50 years or longer. And it's at least out of date by a century. And this is why it's completely implausible. They're looking for an animal that never existed in the first place. They're looking for a dinosaur as we thought of it 100 years ago, not as we know them now. And it's also the case that, not only are there no sightings and no reliable evidence other than the eyewitness reports, but these kinds of things. So this part of the Congo doesn't see rhinos. Rhinos are terrestrial animals, live mostly in the savannah. There's a number of animals that could be what they're looking at. It's simply not part of this culture that lives in the Congo. So the whole set of lines of evidence, starting with the fact that the non-bird dinosaurs have all been extinct for 66 million years, and no record of them ever surviving anywhere on the planet after that. That's, as a paleontologist, I would say, is pretty strong evidence, because the bigger the bone, the more likely it's going to be preserved. Big animals do preserve, and we have plenty of places where giant animals like mammoths and mastodons and other huge meth-bodied animals did survive and were fossilized in the last 66 million years. And never once does any non-bird dinosaur ever show up in those beds. And that includes Africa, where we have a fairly good fossil record in many parts of Africa now. So that's all the more reason to realize it's just a legend that outgrew its base. And the saddest commentary on this, I actually was involved. They used to have a series called Monster Quest. I think it was on Discovery Channel, and still you can find it online. The episode, they had me be the token skeptic for this whole episode. And I had them, they recorded me at my old institution, Occidental College, where I taught at the time, pushing a bunch of dinosaur replicas around on carts and, with background shots of dinosaur replicas and so on. It was a really strange episode because they mostly just filmed me saying stand-ups for them. At one point, they handed me this lump of shapeless piece of plaster and asked me to interpret what it meant. As it's a lump of plaster. And then they gave me more hints. And then finally I realized they were trying to say that it was a cast of a footprint that claimed by these people that was supposedly for sauropod. Well, we know what a sauropod footprint looks like. This is not it. But the thing that I did not realize until long after the episode aired was the so-called scientists they had, or biologists they supposed they had to doing the investigation, were actually creationist ministers with no training in science or wildlife biology whatsoever. And this is a funky little side part of this whole cryptozoology that I didn't realize when I started working on this. A lot of what motivates cryptozoology is creationism. They are
The living dinosaurs,
the
yes.
discovery of a live sauropod in the Congo or a live plesiosaur in Loch Ness will suddenly upturn all the evolutionary biology. And of course, all it would say is that something survived we didn't expect to survive. It wouldn't change anything else but evolution. But that, of course, reflects their complete misunderstanding what evolution's about. So that's really they're
trying to find like
have managed to get some influence and things like putting them in textbooks and so on. They're really trying all sorts of slimy tactics. But these guys were on this program for a full hour, and they had most of the screen time. And all I could see when I finally watched the final cut of the program is these guys aren't biologists. They don't know what the hell they're doing. They're talking about ridiculous things. They don't even know what their equipment's doing. And yet they got the entire program to bumble around and show their incompetence. And
that's what the whole thing is.
I don't expect those programs on those reality TV shows to be anything quality, but still.
Well, the whole thing hinges on this misunderstanding Westerners have, because we've moved on with our technology. We don't have the role of the storyteller in our communities anymore. So the guys telling them that they've seen this monster out in the woods. Yeah, it looks like the one in your book. They're just a storyteller. They tell the story, and people give them a little bit of money. It's a role into their society that we used to have too. We don't anymore because we have television and everything and the internet now. So, but in these far off places, that when they bring those books and show them to people, they bring out the elder guy and he'd come look at it and say, "Oh, yeah, that's what I saw," and then he'd tell the story about when he saw the monster in the jungle, and you give him a couple bucks and go on your way. And that's what he's doing to these silly creationists when they stumble around the jungle like they do.
I mean, in many cultures, they don't make the distinction that we make between reality and myth or reality and legend, right? To them, the legendary world is just as real as the world they actually deal with. And that is not necessarily a universal construct. Most non-Western societies often do that. Legends are as real, and the past is as real, in the form of legend as anything else. So, we're imposing our sense of how they interpret things in the wrong way. We say, okay, well, they saw it.
Right.
Well, yes, their legends tell them they see these things, but it doesn't mean that they saw it in a eyewitness scientific sense. And that's a big part of the problem. So that sort of leads to the other issue of it. And this is something I wrote about both in that book and also the book I did on UFOs, which is in recent years, it's become very obvious the least reliable kind of evidence you can use to find something strange and unexplained, like a UFO or Bigfoot, is eyewitness evidence. We now know that human beings are terrible video recorders. This is something Elizabeth Loftus, a psychologist, has shown, and there are many other studies have been done. And it's changing the way, for example, criminal law is done. Used to be eyewitness evidence was considered the best evidence you could have in a court of law to convict someone. But as you know from these various programs that use DNA, shows a high percentage of people that are convicted by eyewitness evidence are not, in fact, guilty, because eyewitnesses are very unreliable. And it's common the case. People often glance at something for a few seconds, and then their memory enhances and their imagination enhances what they think they saw, and they will often have a more detailed account of the thing they saw, quote unquote, than they really could have had. And when it's actually, for example, done with various types of testing to see what they saw and what they actually could have seen, it's clear the memory enhances it. And the longer it's been since they saw this so-called evidence, whether it's Bigfoot or an alien walking around, the more likely it is that they have changed this memory of it and modified it and elaborated it. So the story gets more and more complicated from the time they first saw it. But even then, you can do all these tests to show humans are terrible at witnessing what's going on, especially if they're not focused on that one thing. If they see it out of the corner of their eye, odds are they didn't see very much at all. And there's a very famous video. I always play this whenever I'm giving a lecture about this topic. It has, I forget the name of it, but it has this situation where you're on camera, you see these 3 players wearing white jerseys and 3 players wearing black jerseys, and they're sort of milling around across the stage. And each group of the 3 is passing a basketball around to the others in their group, the color group.
Yes.
So they're creating a lot of motion, a lot of distraction, and then you're told to focus on, say, how many times the black team passes the ball or whatever. I forget the exact constraints.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
So if you're doing that, you get what's called inattention blindness. You're focused on just what you're told to watch. And most of the time you play that video, more and more people will do this. There's actually a guy in a gorilla suit that walks right through the center of the shot, waves at the camera, and then walks out. And the high percentage of people who are doing their job, which is focusing on how many times the ball is passed, don't see the gorilla right in the middle of the shot. And that is a very, very
phenomenal.
You can't really see much else when we're not looking for it in particular. So
that's a phenomenal video. I've seen that, and I've taken that test knowing what it was supposed to be for. And the gorilla goes by, you seriously do not notice it. And then you go back and watch it the second time.
The passes, you can't.
Yeah.
And then it's not part of what you're searching, you're just looking for.
And then there's the pareidolia that your brain is going to want to do to different things in the woods.
But what's impressive is it is really impressive to what degree we can miss stuff. I mean, it is so laughably obvious when you look at it.
And then make up stuff, because those 2 things working hand in hand. You miss the important stuff and then fill in the blanks with your monkey brain trying to make a face and make something out of what you saw.
It's Michael Shermer, because we are patternicity. We try to fill in blanks. We try to see patterns where there are none. And of course, the Rorschach test and many other things are built on that very presumption that you can give them any people a random collection of dots, and they will see a pattern, right? You can give them a grilled cheese sandwich with a burn mark on it. They will see Jesus, right? That's patternicity. And we're programmed to see things, especially faces. And that, of course, makes good evolutionary sense, because the babies, the first thing they have to recognize in their visual field is their mother's face, of course, along with their mother's voice. And that's a crucial survival thing. So that is something we have very well developed in our sensory system, even though it tends to mislead all the time. So, of course, that's why you see all these patterns that aren't there. And constellations aren't real patterns. They're just people decided these stars form this pattern. So, yeah, that's a big problem. But the bigger issue, and that's something Daniel and I both point out in the book, and I also repeat that in the review book, is if you take out all that so-called eyewitness evidence, there's not much left. Okay, we put it down at the bottom of the least reliable type of evidence you can have, and nearly all the evidence for any kind of cryptid you can think of, or for UFOs or aliens, all of it is just eyewitness evidence, which is questionable from the beginning. And then when you look at the circumstances of each so-called eyewitness account, it's even more questionable. Now, the only evidence scientists would accept, because they are aware of these problems with eyewitness evidence, is actual physical objects, a piece of a UFO or a body part of a Bigfoot or something like that, something really physical and tangible. It's got to be there, or you can't call it scientific. Sounds that Bigfoot makes, or footprints, which are famously hoaxable, all that stuff means zero. And yet is very powerful to the Bigfoot committee, the Squatchers they're called. They really believe, of course, squatching is a religion, right?
The Squatch
You've
Watch.
never seen the Squatcher conferences. These people they've replaced organized religion with belief in Bigfoot.
Wow.
And they're serious. They're very serious about this. This is so important to them. And it means a lot to them personally. It's like a religious belief. You can't do anything.
I think they're more fun now,
because it's a religion to them.
They're more fun than like younger creationist people, in my opinion. I've hung out with the Sasquatch people.
Yeah,
they're
Squatch are hardcore. Yeah, I don't want to deal with them too often. And the harshest reviews we got in our book, naturally, were Squatchers who hated the Bigfoot chapter and then clearly indicated they never looked at any other part of the book, including the introduction, which explains the rules of the game that they have to observe. But what's really funky about them, and also about some of the people like the people at MUFON or the Universe, UFO Network, they like science as a way to sort of reassure themselves that something is true. So they ape scientific methods and ape scientific toys, and they try to look and sound scientific. And, this is scientism, you can call it, or their sound sciencey, as several people call it, but they're not actually using the scientific method, especially the critical thinking aspect of scientific method, which is, assume that nothing is happening, right? The null hypothesis, rather than assume the extraordinary, right? And then the sort of version of that is Carl Sagan's extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? They don't work that way at all. They assume the extraordinary, and then they go backward and try to patch together whatever evidence they think supports their extraordinary belief, and of course ignore everything that doesn't. And so that first chapter of both books is similar in structure, which is, this is the scientific method. We're going to assume nothing is out of the ordinary, and you have to prove by extraordinary evidence otherwise that these things are real. And you can't just assume they're real and then just try to patch together evidence to support it.
You wouldn't think that would be,
because they want to sound sciencey. They want to sound like they're serious, and so especially if you watch these shows of people supposedly hunting ghosts in houses, they'll use all sorts of fancy equipment, but it doesn't prove anything because they're not actually being critical about what they're doing, and they haven't ruled out things like a breeze has caused that their drape to move or something like that. They just assume there's a ghost there, and that somehow one of their pieces of equipment will do something weird, and then anything it does will automatically be evidence a ghost has been in the house. And it's actually what you find out is that when you talk to these people, there's a hierarchy of what's crazy and what's not. So UFO believers are often famous for saying, well, UFOs are real, but ghosts are not. But the evidence for them is just as good, which is no evidence.
So we have a super chat real quick from one of our viewers. Thank you so much, Oliver D. Smith. Always good to see you out there. I want to know what your thoughts are on Gregory Forth's Between Ape and Human. Are you familiar with that work?
No, I don't know that particular author. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. They wanted to ask. Thank you so much.
I tried to do research, but that book was 10 years ago. So
yeah, I think your video feed might have froze. You look like you're frozen on my end.
I don't see my motion. Everyone's frozen on mine. Do I need to get out?
It'll come back.
It'll come back. It'll catch up with you. There you go.
We're back.
There you are. Yeah.
So here's another question from Oliver. I'll bring it up since we couldn't answer his other ones. How about this one?
Ooh, will there be a sequel?
Will there be a sequel from Abominable Science book?
We've thought about it because the first book actually was shortened over what I wanted. I actually wrote a chapter about Chupacabra, and I wrote a chapter about a couple other topics, which were supposed to go in the book. And then the chapters about sea monsters and Bigfoot and Nessie got to be so huge that the publisher was not happy about the length of the book. So I
Oh,
had sacrificed a couple of my shorter chapters, which I'd written about elsewhere and they've been published online at least. And then I just decided, okay, well, I only have to put them in there. And if they were interested in a sequel, that would be nice to have a second edition, in other words, which would have those additional chapters in it and update those things. But at the moment, I don't see that happening. Daniel's busy with other stuff now. I don't think he's interested in doing it.
yeah.
And frankly, I've got too much on my plate too. I've
Darren
got
You never,
Naish puts
you
out
actually
never,
working
some.
research in New York City at the American Museum, and I've got a bunch of scientific papers I've just been cranking out one after another this week since I got back. So
wow.
Uh,
You never run out of
Darren
stuff to do, it seems.
Darren Naish is a good author in that vein too. I just want to say I think he's an ornithologist by trade, but he does cryptozoology books
well,
that
he
he's
was trained in
mentioned too.
paleontology actually, but
Yeah.
yes, he does many things. Darren and I are good friends. So
Yeah.
Darren
Did
was my co-leader on the 2016 UK trip because we had 98 people in that trip, so we had to have two coaches. And so Darren ran coach number 2 and I ran coach number 1, and we had to coordinate it. So we were never at all the same place at the same time, most of the stops, because they were overwhelmed. All 98 of us got out there at once. So it was a big trip.
Do you think cryptozoology is good or bad for science?
Well, cryptozoology is actually outside of science altogether, right? Because its fundamental assumptions are not scientific, although it's capable of being scientific if it's willing to be skeptical and willing to adhere to rules of evidence, which is something I spell out in the last chapter of the book. But the only place I see it having it, well, Daniel was sort of optimistic. He was not thinking that cryptozoology had much in the way of a negative effect on science or society. Having been a cryptozoologist himself when he was younger, and then basically become skeptical of it as he got older and smarter. But my feeling is there are elements of it that are not helpful, and that is especially where the creationists use cryptozoology as a wedge to get into school curricula. That's where they try to introduce the Loch Ness Monster and Mokele Mbembe to school books and so on, and claim that that starts out as a innocent little piece of biology that is not taught in high schools, but it's really a vehicle for people to drift into their belief system. I'm not sure how effective that is, but I'm not really happy with that. And on the broader point, cryptozoology just fosters magical thinking, right? It fosters belief in
Yeah.
crazy ideas, and it's not helpful in a society where we do need to be much more reality focused. I mean, we don't. It's okay. Everyone has a right to do what they want to do with their private time, but we need to be really clear on the reality of things like climate change and other things which are happening, which are changing the planet and changing our society. And if we're a lot of people are out chasing the ghosts of Bigfoot or whatever, they're basically out of the loop as far as being useful to society. We need society to focus on what's real, and so society to focus on what's important in the long run, because we're up against a wall in terms of things like climate and economic issues and so on. Many things are coming to a head, and a lot of us in the science, especially in the climate science, like I do now, are very worried about that. So that's how I view that.
All right. We also have a question from our own team here. Just want to know: has there ever been a cryptid that was proven to exist? And some cryptids are, as we mentioned before, are animals that we know existed that people are reporting seeing after they've become
Right.
extinct. Like you see, like the
Well,
thylacine, the mammoth that we mentioned
right.
previously, and
Right.
some primates and such. But go on, Don. I'm
Right.
sorry.
Yeah. The question has several parts. So one is that yes, there are new animals found nearly all the time, but they're almost always another species of this or that animal that's already known and was probably actually already seen but mistaken for something else, and they separated two animals which are really closely related and looked very similar, discovered they were two different species. There has been no large land animal found that wasn't known by science since 1904. Okay, so over a century. That's when they
Wow.
discovered the okapi and a few other things that were hiding in the deepest jungles of Africa. There's no, there's the Patagonian peccary is one of the only most recent ones, but it also looks very much like other peccaries to people who are not experts. So the real thing is there's nothing on land anymore that we expect to ever be discovered that hasn't already been discovered. And the only one they consistently bring it to our attention is, well, they found a coelacanth in 1937. And yes, the coelacanths were thought to be extinct since the Cretaceous, but then found in the deep sea. And the deep sea may be the exception. Certainly, the deep sea is not as well explored as land is, but it's not very likely they're going to put up with an animal like any air-breathing animal like Loch Ness Monster, because that would be seen by people much sooner. It would have to be some kind of a fish or something that lives in the deepest ocean, like the coelacanth does, that we would find it. So the reality is, it's unlikely we'll ever find something like that. And if you look at the actual literature of cryptozoology, starting back in the 30s when Heuvelmans and the others first named the thing and established the first society, by definition, those things don't count as cryptids. A cryptid is by definition something that's never been seen by science and is considered to be outside the realm of science and then somehow exists anyway. So they have self-defined the thing so that no animal that we consider reasonably likely to be found, something like another species of peccary, is a cryptid, right? They want something that's really odd. That's actually in their definition. It's got to be spectacular and different from everything else. And that's what I Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster is what they have in mind. So in that case, they pretty much made sure we'll never find a cryptid.
So sometimes there seems to be a specific group of animals that get identified as cryptids, right? Or misidentified as cryptids from people who aren't used to seeing those types of animals. The big one is owls. In the North America, people see large owls doing their threat posture, where they throw their wings and their tail feathers up behind them, so it looks like a big headdress with little eyes down at the front. That's standing on a fence post about 6 foot up is going to look terrifying in the dark. And then there's basking sharks, which decay in this really plesiosaur-like way,
especially when they're decayed.
And of course, there's the Baird's beak whale, which it's so rare and it looks very serpentine compared to other whales you might see. What are some other ones that we get misidentified?
The biggest thing you find with a lot of the crypt reports, and this is especially true of Bigfoot, but to a lesser extent of other things, the people who look for them aren't trained biologists. They're usually just enthusiastic amateurs who want to tromp around the woods. Instead of taking a gun to kill something with it, they're out there to supposedly take a picture of Bigfoot. And these people don't know enough about the animals that actually live in the forest to know what they're looking at. And they had the famous episodes of the great $10,000 Bigfoot bounty about 10 years ago on cable TV. Both of the scientists who are involved in that are good friends of mine. Todd Distel and Natalia Reagan were the two scientists who were there. But the guys who they recruited, the 10 teams of 3 or 4 people that were recruited to find Bigfoot in this big area where they had been let loose on, they were hilarious because they made everything they saw or heard evidence of Bigfoot. And first of all, that, as you say, owls not just can look like something strange and mysterious, but more often than not, owls make lots of calls. If you're not familiar with the saw-whet owl, the long-eared owl, or some of these others, they make calls which are very spooky looking and sounding. And if you're not a good woodsman who knows your wildlife, you would not know that's an owl that made that call. So several times in that episode, you see these squatchers out there in the dark while stumbling around, getting a little afraid, and they hear a call, and any biologist knows that's a saw-whet owl. And that's what they think Bigfoot sounds like, and they're recording the sound. And the same goes with a lot of the evidence, not just from that show, but in general. A lot of people see something walking in the woods. It's sort of about 5-6 feet tall, and it's dark and hairy. They get a glimpse at it. They assume it's Bigfoot. They don't realize that the American brown bears do that all the time. American brown bears spend a lot of time walking on 2 legs, and they have very distinctive appearance when they do that. And there's a lot of footage out there where you can see a brown bear looking just like a primate walking. And if you're not close to it and you see it from a distance, you wouldn't be able to really tell for sure that's what it was.
Through the leaves and
and
bears tend to be scratching up on something.
Object walking on 2 legs. You never think that bears actually do this quite a bit. I've seen them do it. And the other thing you'll hear squatchers claim is that, well, we point out to them there's never once been a bone or any hard tissue of any Bigfoot ever found in all these places they supposedly live. And they say, well, bears don't leave traces either. You know, they never find bear bones. Well, I found bear bones working in the mountains of Wyoming, for example. They're not that rare, and bears are rare animals in general, but they're out there, and yet never once has a bone been left behind. That's what really we're required to, give us some sense that there's something to Sasquatch besides the usual smoke and mirrors. It's all about evidence, and it's all about something that's more concrete than just sound or blurry footage. And in fact, the irony is, there's a famous cartoon about this, points this out. All that time that they're taking videos with clumsy movie cameras and so on, the last 30 years, every one of us has been walking around with a camera in our pockets, now capable of doing video as well as still images. And the evidence for UFOs and ghosts and Bigfoot has only gotten worse now that there are millions of people walking around with cameras in their pockets. And that should tell you right there, there's a law of diminishing returns here, that if these things are real and all these people are still thrashing around the woods looking for them, they have a camera, so they're not going to be caught by surprise and not have a camera with them. They've got it in their pocket all the time. So if there were really something out there, we'd get better pictures and more of them. And the reality is we're getting fewer pictures, and the ones we get are crummier, which is almost exactly what you expect if there's nothing really out there, but people just fantasizing about stuff that they hear or sort of see through the bushes, but don't get a good look at. So
if you can,
I gotta ask, is there any cryptid that you think might be real?
Well, the conventional ones, no. I mean, they're all based on misunderstandings of zoology, primarily, like Loch Ness Monster and the Bigfoot and the Mokele Mbembe. I mean, I'm not, as I said, something like a new species of peccary or a new species of primate or a new species of quadrimundi, all of which have been found in the last 50 years, is not that surprising to me, but that's not something they would count as a cryptid. So yeah, I'd say the answer is anything that they consider extraordinary, which you have to be a cryptid. It has to be extraordinary and unsurprising. That's in their definition of cryptozoology, as they originally defined it in the 30s. That I would rule out.
I would love to see the thylacine be found alive somewhere.
Yeah, the thylacine's a different story, right? It's not a cryptid. It lived, and we have plenty of both.
Well, I'll be the cryptozoologist.
And, several carcasses, and quite a few carcasses actually were pickled and otherwise preserved in museums. So it's not an animal that is strange or mysterious. It's actually a living animal that we think is extinct, but it is very secretive. And yes, there have been better and better suggestions that there might be a surviving population left in Tasmania. It's hard to know.
What is this animal?
I have to capture one, and we probably
what type
won't.
of animal is this?
Again, that's sort of a hard cause to chase, because even if you had one, you probably wouldn't be able to recover the population. So.
So Phil, it was a wolf size, or smaller than a wolf.
Is another name for the Tasmanian wolf, which is not actually a wolf, but a marsupial, related to the Tasmanian devil, which of course is not a devil. And
a
cat-like dasyurids, they're called, marsupials, found both in Australia and Tasmania. They thylacines are sort of built like wolves. They're the marsupial, convergently evolved to look sort of wolf-like in their build. Except they have pouches and joeys and all the rest. And then they were captured and hunted mercilessly, because everything that could possibly kill a chicken is always hunted mercilessly, and then driven to extinction in the early part of the 20th century. I believe 1936, the last one in a Hobart Zoo died. And though we don't think there's any more out there, but every once in a while someone thinks there might be a possibility of a small population surviving in the more remote jungles of Tasmania, which is a pretty wet area, by the way. So.
And people the reports that come in that I hear are vague, but they're more promising than what you hear about people reporting Bigfoot. They're not reporting anything phenomenal, like, hey, I saw this kind of looked like a Tasmanian wolf.
That's just rediscovering something we knew about that we think has gone extinct, and then that's not anywhere close to cryptozoology, because these animals we know they existed. We have the pickled specimens and a bunch of other parts of them still around. We have their DNA, right?
Well, I guess it's cryptozoology.
It might be worth trying if you're going to bring an animal back to life. Their DNA is better shaped than, say, a mammoth's DNA, because it's much younger. There's been discussion about trying to do that, but again, there's like all these other ideas about bringing back animals that are now extinct. There's always this sort of ethical issue. What do you do if you do succeed? Where do you put them? What kinds of things are you going to do with them? That doesn't make their life worse. It's very difficult to put mammoths back on the planet. If we did it, we couldn't create another mammoth steppe in the Arctic, because the Arctic has already changed too much for them to ever live there. And of course, the land is all human used now. Wherever it's usable for people, the cows take it over. So no one's going to give that land up for mammoths either way. So they become zoo freaks, and there's a lot of people argue that's not very ethical. So
I support rewilding, but
that's what's called rewilding. Yeah.
Yeah, but you got to be careful with how you manage it,
Right,
because you make local people mad. Like
right.
we're introducing the wolves to what the Western United States is really
And
got
that's an
up
animal
in
that
some
wasn't
people's,
extinct. It just was taken
mm,
out locally. So yeah, no, I real
yeah,
wilding is an interesting idea, but in reality, I think it's been talked about. Recovering the old mammoth steppe that used to live in northern part of North America during the ice ages, which had mammoths and a lot of other things like bison, which are
camels
still around,
and
but many which
bison
are now
and
extinct. Horses and camels, which didn't used to didn't live in North America, and are gone now, naturally at
mhm,
least. Putting that back together, but again, whose land are you going to put it on? And where are you going to find a habitat to support them that's remotely like what they lived on during the last ice age? We don't even really know for sure what kind of terrain they might have lived on. And at the time when the Arctic itself is changing, because it's the area that's changing the fastest thanks to climate change. So the freezing of the northern part of the Arctic, especially, all the permafrost is now thawing, and the Arctic itself is going ice free longer and longer. So even animals that are supposed to live there, like polar bears and walruses, are now threatened with extinction. So,
yeah.
I think that's a problem that misses out on, or misses what's really important to the planet, which is we got to save what's already alive and try to prevent things like that from happening first before we talk about putting mammoths back on the planet.
Yeah, let's rewild the animals that aren't extinct before we
Yeah.
rewild
Try
the
to get
ones
their
that are.
habitat back
Yeah,
other than zoos. So,
So
right.
how are we doing on DNA sequencing for non-humans? Basically, I know there's been quite an effort to start that. Do we have enough information
well,
yet
yeah, DNA
that
has been
we?
sequenced on quite a few animals now. Of course, the charismatic things like chimps and gorillas and so on were done first, along with certain lab animals.
Hmm.
There's several hundred things now that have pretty complete DNA sequences in the gen bank and so on. You could all their DNA sequences on public information if you have the right
Oh,
website. Um, that's one question. Another question is, do you have enough DNA to make a new animal? That was what you're asking. That's
no,
been a
because
problem, and
well,
includes
because I'm
especially the efforts to bring mammoth back,
yeah,
because DNA decays very, very fast.
yeah.
Literally start decaying as soon as the animal's living tissues die, and it takes just a few hundred years for most tissue to break down so far the DNA is mostly unrecoverable. They just get little fragments of the DNA. And so, yes, it's been possible to get a partial sequence of DNA from some of the mummified mammoths of Siberia that are in extraordinary shape. That's been done. In a few other animals, that's been done too as well. But that's a far cry from having enough DNA to put them back together and then say put an embryo of a mammoth in a mother elephant's uterus. And that's, of course, right to the old Jurassic Park scenario, which is
Right.
Jurassic Park is still fiction and always will be, because the way the assumptions, of course, Crichton was not a geologist or a geneticist. He was just, speculating what he knew of genetics at the time, which was the 70s
Writing
when he
fun
wrote it.
fiction.
That, that you can't just patch DNA together like Legos, right? It's got very specific things. It's bound up in certain three-dimensional structures. You replace one thing, it all falls apart. You can't patch together frog DNA like they do in the movies with, say, dinosaur DNA. The best you can do if you ever wanted to recover a dinosaur, and this has already partially been done, is to mess around with bird DNA. Usually, chickens is the easiest animal to work with. They've made chickens now that have long, bony tails like Archaeopteryx. They made chickens that have beaks that turn into dinosaur mouths, complete with teeth. And the teeth are not the teeth of, say, an animal used for experiments. They're true dinosaur teeth. They've had chickens which they can now, the chicken wing is, the fingers are all that narrow little piece of bone that sticks on the end of the wing you don't eat. And so birds no longer have a true hand. Their hand is all fused together. Well, that's been manipulated genetically. So now they have chickens that have true fingers. All that is
Are
possible
they
because
doing
chickens
this
are dinosaurs like all of the birds. And
are
so
they
they
doing
can
this by
reverse these
activating
things that are locked
sections?
into birds and bring back some dinosaurs and characteristics and get you a dinosaur chicken. But that's not Jurassic Park or Jurassic
Yeah.
World. It's very different.
Are they activating elements that are already in that DNA in
Right.
nuclear
Yes. The
sections? What's what they're
DNA
doing?
of
Atavisms.
dinosaurs is still there. Okay.
Yeah.
The dinosaurian tail, the dinosaurian teeth, the dinosaurian hand, all of which birds have suppressed and turned off. They turned off the genetic switches for those things. So they never manifest them in normal circumstances, but they managed to manipulate those so that they can undo those switches and release these things by various techniques. And that's just showing us what we already knew, which is, birds like Archaeopteryx are dinosaurian, right? They have fingers, they have a bony tail, they have teeth, all things which modern birds don't have. And so that's just reversing it. What in nature they would call it atavism, when something like that reverses itself and you end up with something that's left over from evolutionary throwback is the old term for it. But again, that's, you just get a chicken with a bony tail and fingers, not a T-Rex. So it's not Jurassic Park was and always will be fiction, no matter what they want to say.
Fun fiction,
Yeah.
but yeah. It reminds me of what you said earlier. When there's nothing new out there, I mean, if we have enough DNA on record of enough animals, we can not only tell that this is related to that, the peccaries or whatever, but we have enough DNA to know that, to be able to tell that this thing we found, even if it may be a transitional thing, is well documented as a transitional thing because of the way the DNA is structured and the ones we know about.
Right. Well, that's probably one of our strongest evidence of evolution now, is something Darwin had no way of knowing, and not possible to know till the 1960s, which is how much the entire tree of life is built into every cell in your body. If you separate out your cells of your body and pull out the DNA strands and do the appropriate manipulations, you've got your entire family history built into your DNA. So, especially when you compare your DNA to any other animals.
We have a lot of atavisms that we can activate or they get activated in humans sometimes too. It's just a matter of what genes could happen to get activated from natural causes. I don't think we're at the point where we're manipulating humans to have primitive traits artificially at this point.
The most famous example of that is every once in a while humans are born with a bony tail.
Yeah.
Still have the gene for the monkey's tail, which all apes and humans normally have shut off. But every once in a while, every 1 in 10 million births or somebody, the human is born with a monkey, not a big tail, only has 2 or 3 vertebrae in it, but it's true tail. It's not just something out of the sci-fi. And usually that's surgically removed as soon as the baby's born, so they don't have to deal with the stigma of it. But I've seen pictures of adults that have them where they were not removed. So yeah, the genes for a tail, every one of them has it. I always joke to my classes, I can't look in your pants right now, but if you don't, I assume you don't have a tail in there. So,
well, I was told that the gene that causes hair lip is also an atavism, but and
there's a lot of genes that come back to our earlier ancestors that are suppressive, but they every once in a while they don't work, and so we get things that show up in early human lineages that then sometimes show up again in modern humans. We're not completely shut down for all those things.
How much of a range do you think we have in epigenetics? I'm thinking of like the humans in the Himalayas that have got more dense red blood cells or more red cells to be able to live in lower oxygen.
Higher altitude.
Yeah.
Right. There are a lot of people, I wrote about this at the end of my book about humans that I just did a few years ago. My new evolution book. That's right. I'm trying to remember which book I wrote that in. I talked about a final chapter, where is evolution taking humans? And in sci-fi, it's always about brains getting bigger and all this other stuff. That's, the brains getting bigger and other parts of the body getting less important because they're supposedly all driven by brains. But in reality, what's happening is actually already happening, which is bit by bit, certain human populations are changing in very subtle ways that you don't think about, but they are evolution on a very small scale. So, for example, our faces have gotten shorter in the latter 200,000 or 300,000 years of human evolution. As our faces have gotten shorter, we developed a chin. Of course, it's not a feature; it's just the absence of a feature. And as our face gets shorter, we have no room for all the teeth we used to have. And so, as many of you know, you get their third molar, your last molars erupting back to the jaw, erupts usually in your teen years. That's why they're called wisdom teeth. And supposedly, you're more wise when they're born, although teens are not so wise, actually. But anyway, that's what the story is. And of course, a very high percentage of people in the American population and most populations have wisdom teeth which don't have room in the jaw. So they get impacted or rotated or whatever, and usually have to be removed with surgery these days. But in certain populations, the wisdom teeth are no longer developing at all. And so if you want to say, where is humans going to be in the future? Well, my first prediction will be they won't have third molars. That's already vanishing from the human population. Another gene, which has been present in us all the time, but got switched off and then switched on and switched off, is a gene for just processing lactose, right? That gene is built into us as babies to be able to process mother's milk. And in many cultures, it disappears after babies are weaned. And so they cannot digest cheese or anything else that's milk derived. But ever since the introduction of domestic animals, especially cows and goats, human populations have managed to keep that gene switched on permanently so they can digest, goat's milk or cow's milk or the products like cheese that come from it. And so bit by bit, most lactose intolerance is disappearing from the human population because most of the human population consumes milk products into adulthood, which needs not to be the case. That's the subtle kind of thing that's going on all the time. And that's how evolution works. It's tiny, it's subtle. It's on the scale of human generations, it's almost invisible. But, if I want to predict what humans will be like 200 years from now, they will all have lactose tolerance and no third molars. That's where human evolution goes. Not giant brains. In fact, our brains actually shrink a bit over the last couple of centuries. So that's going against the prediction. But something like that would be more likely.
Interesting.
All right. Well, we're just right at the hour right now. Let's just go around real quick and just have everybody do me a favor and tell me what your favorite cryptid is and why. I want to start with Phil.
Oh, geez. I don't even have
on the spot.
I don't even have a favorite. I guess I'll go with like the Nessie, the sea monster stuff, because I like the idea or the image of the
undulating
back. Yeah, I used to have a little thing in my aquarium that was just like this little the thing.
Quite a
you put
few
on
live
the,
fish
on the
today that
bottom.
make a
It's just cute.
good Nessie if they were giant. So
Yeah.
All right. How about you, Don?
I would guess Mokele Mbembe because it's closest to dinosaurs, which I used to be very crazy about. And so, although I don't study dinosaurs professionally anymore, I study mammals, which there's a lot more opportunity, a lot more fossils. Nonetheless, I think the first one I really paid attention to was Mokele Mbembe.
All right. Well, I love Mothman. That's my guy. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
I like. Someday I want to go down to their festival they have every year down there for the Mothman Festival. That'll be fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you want to thank our. I want to thank our patrons there.
Yeah, so let's bring up the patron list, Wes, if you could, and we'll do that.
Yeah.
I can start to. I want to put Don's book up there while I'm thinking of it. Let's see if I
Thank
can
you.
think
Yeah.
of them offhand.
In 10 years, it'd be nice to have a nice sales boost.
Yeah, would it? It would. Please check it out. Sidney Davis Jr. That's intentional. Eric Ozels, Tara S., Ryan, Deneen Murphy, Dan D., Michael Weissman, Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Sunny Shell, Aaron Colson, and myself. Thank you, everybody. And please help us add to that list a little bit. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Go ahead to take that one, Bree.
All right. So don't forget to check out our other great shows on Skeptic Haven, including Secular Soapbox on Wednesday, Thursdays, The Sunny Spot with me and Sunny, and Saturdays, The Global Atheist and Women Atheist Unload, and Let's Talk on Sunday.
Yeah, so if you still believe in the abominable snowman or anything like that, give us a call and let's talk about why exactly you believe that.
Yeah, and if you want to read all about it, it's in the book.
Yeah. Read this book. Yeah, this book right here. If you think you're abominable snowman, check it out.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw this one up too, just because I've got it now. Your UFO book done. You've got so many books. It's crazy. It's crazy how fast you write. It is.
I knew there was another 14 books that he had written.
No, you're over 40.
I'm on
now,
almost the 50th book now. So
yeah, I was gonna say you're over 40. Last I heard.
I've got one that
That's
just went to production for Columbia University Press on climate change, and this summer I've got to do a new edition of my California geology book, so I'm gonna make 50.
Yeah, so. and I gotta say, in general, if you are a parent looking to educate your kids on anything in this realm, Google Donald Prothero books, and you will find some of the best stuff on evolution, on paleontology, on geology. It's really quite phenomenal, and these are. I want to say they're fun, but they're not that difficult to read. You've written them clearly, very clearly.
I've tried to write for a general audience, yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I learned from teaching undergraduates who are not much more educated than most of your audience, and that's the level I'm dealing with. Mm-hmm. So I teach to that level, and you learn to communicate that way. So
yeah, definitely recommend it. Please check it out.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Don. I look forward
Oh,
to
thank you. I enjoyed it.
yeah,
I'm willing to do another show anytime you want. So,
absolutely. I look forward to working with you in the future.
all
Thanks.
right.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Take care. Thanks.